Hope you're sitting comfortably, because today we'll be examining the flying machines of the First World War in an attempt to glean an educated guess at what winged death traps will be included in Battlefield 1. The Great War was the first major conflict in history to use weaponized aircraft. Initially, however, planes were merely used for reconnaissance. Rival pilots would first exchange waves and various other gestures as they passed one another. Things did escalate rather quickly though, with reports of hand grenades being thrown, grappling hooks, and even ramming enemy planes. In October of 1914, a French mechanic named Louis Quinault brought a machine gun on board, presumably mistaking it for some bread. "Sacre bleu, this is not my baguette!" He shortly opened fire on German aircraft, thus spurring the world into an era of aerial combat. Initially, the beautiful British Vickers FB5, also known as the gun bus, helped control the air along with the French Morane-Saulnier. The Vickers FB5 utilised a pusher configuration for the propeller, this meaning the thrust came from behind, and that the gunner could sit at the front of the plane firing outwards. The French Morane-Saulnier had a machine gun that could fire through the arc of the front of the propeller, allowing it to be manned and gunned by one person. This unmatched command of the air was soon to change when the Germans unveiled the Fokkers. And Fokkers they did. From July 1915 through till the end of the year, a period known as the Fokker Scourge, the Germans dominated the air. Looking back at some of the first moments of the Battlefield 1 trailer, I think we can clearly identify a Morane-Saulnier style plane. Much of the imagery in the trailer is very brief and sometimes unclear due to motion blur, so I can't make out any Vickers FB5s. Many of the planes developed later into the war had very similar designs. What we can clearly see, however, is some rather strikingly iconic red Fokker triplanes. During the war, news of aerial combat victories raised the spirits of armymen and civilians alike. Many of the skilled pilots became famous household names like the medieval knights of yore. Looking back at the statistical data for the aerial battles fought, most were won by 5% of the pilots who fought in them. Tally-ho! Manfred von Richthofen was arguably the most famous flying ace of all time, nicknamed by ally and enemy alike as the Red Baron. He and his squadron famously painted their planes red. The Germans weren't the only one with flying aces, oh no. Albert Hall, accredited with 44 victories, was a British ace who apparently shot down but did not wound the younger brother of the Red Baron. Ball died valiantly in combat, and upon hearing of Ball's death, the Red Baron remarked, saying that he was by far the best English flying man. But what does this mean for Battlefield 1? The fact that the Fokker triplane is seen completely in red leads me to believe that the character of the Red Baron will feature in the single-player campaign. But will he exist in the multiplayer? I think that with the influence of Star Wars Battlefront's development, we could see some kind of special hero spawn, where a rare spawn becomes available, allowing for the use of famous aerial aces planes. Many of the fighter planes, as I mentioned just now, didn't really have wildly striking differences. The Fokker M5 was closely based on the Morane-Saulnier monoplanes. I believe it is most likely that we'll see a smattering of variations on the mono, bi and triplanes, with 1 and 2 seat variations, as well as varying gun positions, cones of fire and manoeuvrability. The Fokker triplanes, for example, were heralded for their ability to climb swiftly, but were not as fast in a straight line as other planes. The skies were not just filled with air-to-air attack vehicles. Bombs were dropped by both sides. The Germans initially used Zeppelins, and as we have seen in the trailers, Zeppelins are indeed confirmed to be in the game in some capacity. Will these act like bombers in BF4? I certainly think it's possible. Some kind of control tower perhaps, which when captured allows you to control the Zeppelin. The bombers were not purely confined to Zeppelins. 2-seater biplanes were used. The British Handley Page heavy bomber, whilst slow and considered vulnerable, had 2 seats with a rear gunner that made directly pursuing fighter pilots sitting ducks. These planes could field 8 to 16 pieces of ordnance, depending on the poundage. I'm quite interested to know how these will be delivered in-game. Will players have to make use of drift sights, or will we get a more modern gaming approach? The Germans also had heavy bombers, the Gotha GV, crewed by 3 men, which had a pilot and both a forward and rear gunner. Will we see 3-person air vehicles in Battlefield 1? It's happened in Battlefield with jeeps and in the past with tanks. I would like to think that 3-seater bombers will be included, so long as there's only 1 per team. Finally, towards the end of the war, a 3rd aircraft category reared its head. That category was ground attack planes. There was a need for air to be able to support the troops on the ground directly, but fire coming from below would often penetrate the aircraft and kill the pilots and mechanics. Ground attack planes were slower, but had armoured fuselages that protected their pilots and gunmen from the upward-facing fire. Germany was the first army to field ground attack planes with the Junkers. Essentially, the design idea was to create a flying steel bathtub, and by Jove were they effective, having only one ever recorded to have been shot down. Now, we haven't covered all of the planes used in World War I. Many iterations were used by all countries involved in the war, but what's fundamental is that we can expect biplanes, triplanes, bombers, and hopefully some ground